Hi, I'm Brother Guy Consolmagno, the director of the Vatican Observatory. You can see me here, the guy with the beard, talking to my boss. All the different priests and brothers who work at the Vatican Observatory, there's about a dozen of us, had a special audience with him last year, and here I'm giving him a copy of our annual calendar. I'd love to talk more about the Vatican Observatory, but today what I want to concentrate on is choices. The choices that I made that wound me up in this picture talking to the Pope, and the choices that everybody makes all throughout our lives. A lot of people are surprised that there is a Vatican Observatory because there's this temptation to divide our experience into separate categories, faith versus science, emotions versus logic. But that's a false division. Because real people are not just, Kirk or Spock, and heck, even Kirk and Spock weren't Kirk and Spock. They each were a mixture of emotion and logic. But the point is, you can't do science without having a knack for non-rational intuitions, hunches. You have to have a hunch of, is this really the right experiment to do? Is that really the right theory to pursue? And likewise, religious experience starts with experience, hard data. That hard data that needs to be explained. And this is the point I want to make. It's on the basis of both reason and hunches that we make all the decisions of our lives. Let me tell you a story. I get asked about science and religion all the time, and it was in one of those conversations that I got an interesting insight into science and religion and why people think that there's a problem. Oddly enough, that conversation was with Captain Kirk. Now, how I wound up talking to William Shatner, the actor that played Captain Kirk, that's a long story, too long for here. But when I described myself as a Jesuit brother and a scientist, he was flabbergasted. Wait a minute, I could hear him say. As we talked, though, it suddenly became clear to me, something that was so obvious to him he'd taken it for granted, but I had never thought of before. He saw religion and science as two competing sets of truths, two big books of facts. And then, of course, what happens if the facts in one book contradict the facts in the other book? Of course. If you think that science and religion are just two big books of facts to be memorized, then I can imagine you'd see that kind of conflict. But that's not science, and that's not religion. Let me give you an example. The orbits of the planets are facts. Now, you can describe them like Ptolemy did back in Roman times, using epicycles of perfect circles of orbits going around perfect circles of orbits all going around the Earth. Or you can describe them like Kepler did, following ellipses that go around the sun. If all you want to do is to come up with a way to describe how they move, either description can be tweaked to give equally accurate descriptions of how the planets move. That's the facts. But only Kepler's ellipses will give you the insight that leads to Newton's law of gravity. The point is, science isn't the facts of the orbits. It's what you do with the facts. And incidentally, our faith isn't based on rigid certainties either. I remember telling William Shatner this phrase that Anne Lamott wrote. She used it to describe faith as, the opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is certainty. And that was completely the opposite of what Shatner thought faith was. He'd heard that phrase, blind faith, and thought it meant accepting something as certain without looking, or even worse, closing your eyes to the facts and proceeding on emotion. But that's not faith at all. To the contrary, this is what Moses says to his people after he comes down the mountain with the tablets. He says, do not forget the things your eyes have seen, or let them fade from your heart as long as you live. Teach them to your children and to their children after them. It's not close your eyes, but rather teach what you have seen. Blind faith is not walking with blindfolds, blinding ourselves to truth. It's proceeding after we've done everything we can to see And still, we can't see everything, because even when we're blind, even when we can't see, even when we don't have total and complete knowledge of the truth, you still have to proceed. If we knew the answer, we wouldn't need faith. Certainty is the opposite of faith. But we don't know. We never have all the facts. And so faith is how we deal with the fact that we have to proceed every way and make choices about where we're going to go to school, or what career we're going to pursue, or where we're going to live, or who we're going to marry. All of life is making crucial decisions on the basis of inadequate information. And by the way, that's what's wrong with being an agnostic, saying, oh, well, I can't possibly know if there's a God or not, so I'll just not bother trying to make a choice. Of course you don't know for sure. Nobody knows for sure. That's why we call it faith. But not making a choice is also making a choice. And when push comes to shove, in the big life and death moments that are going to happen to all of us in our lives, you're going to kind of wish you had something available to help you out. These choices that we make that change our lives are made not only on the basis of inadequate and sometimes incorrect information, they're also made by ignorant, stupid, stubborn, inexperienced teenagers, like the guy I was when this picture was taken, when I made some important choices that changed my life. I was 18. Graduated from the Jesuit high school in Detroit. I had no idea what I wanted to study next. I decided to study history at Boston College, mostly because it was in Boston, which seemed like a good place to be a student. There's like 300 odd colleges and universities in Boston, some of them very odd. And Boston College was a Jesuit university. I had the idea that maybe I was going to want to be a Jesuit priest, but I wasn't sure. I was also a nerd. Maybe you can tell from the photo. When it came time for me to declare a major, I tried to find the box that said all of the above. I wanted to learn everything. I chose history, thinking that, well, everything has a history. But when I got to Boston College, I found myself in a freshman dorm where the local liquor store would make deliveries. The legal drinking age was 21. We were 18. They didn't seem to mind. And an awful lot of the guys in the dorm went nuts doing all that stuff that they always thought they wanted to do, but their parents wouldn't let them back when they were living with their parents. And I remember one Friday night, there was this guy who tried to drink an entire bottle of rum and eat a tin of smoked octopus. I saw him in the hallway about to be sick into the trash barrel, and then he stopped. Something was wrong. He looked puzzled. Slowly, he took off his trousers, laid them carefully over the trash barrel, and then got sick into them. Eventually, these geniuses started failing their classes, no surprise. Well, that wouldn't have bothered me, except for some reason, they would come to my room and pour out their problems to me, as if I cared. The more they bewailed their situation, the more I thought to myself, life is tough, and it's especially tough when you're stupid. I didn't like it there. I didn't fit in. So I figured, okay, there's no problem so big you can't run away from it. Time to bail out. So I figured, okay, I'll join the Jesuits. I was thinking of doing that anyway. So I found a Jesuit, and I asked him, where do I sign up? And he asked me a very peculiar question. Have you prayed about this, son? I hate it when they call you son. Okay, what I'm thinking, 18 years old, who prays, but, if prayer is probably part of the routine of being a priest, I guess I ought to do that. Why not? So I went back to my room and sat on the floor and looked at the ceiling and said, okay, God, here I am. I'm supposed to ask you if you want me to be a Jesuit priest. That I know you're desperate for priests, and I'm desperate to get out of here. Nothing. Nothing came from the ceiling. And I was feeling really foolish. So, while I'm sitting there waiting for something to happen, a funny thought popped into the back of my head. What does a priest do for a living? When they show up at their desk on a Monday morning, I assume priests have desks, so what's on the desk? Papers, yeah. What kind of papers? Papers about what? Papers about people. People with problems. People just like the idiots in my dorm that I'm trying to get away from. You know, that'd be a terrible job for me. Did I mention I was a nerd? Didn't do people very well. Well, either there was no God, because I hadn't heard anything, in that case it would be stupid to be a priest, or there was a God, and he had just told me it would be stupid for me to be a priest. So instead, I asked myself a different question. What did I really want to do? When was I happy? Now, it turns out my best friend from high school was studying just up the road at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and I'd hang out there with him every weekend. They had weekend movies and tunnels you could explore in the basements connecting the buildings, and the world's largest library of science fiction. And, nerds and geeks, people like me. Well, if I wanted to be a nerd, why not go to nerd school? On a whim, I applied to transfer, and they accepted me. And when I got there, I was ecstatically happy, like I didn't think I ever could be. This is what I was good at, but more important, this is what I loved. I had finally found my passion. It wasn't the science fiction, it was the science. It wasn't the tunnels, it was the exploration. It wasn't the movies, it was the imagination. And it wasn't just the work, it was being part of a community of fellow nerds. Even though I felt like an imposter, it turns out everybody who studies physics thinks they're an imposter. But it makes me realize, for every Harry Potter fan who wishes they could do magic, there's probably a dozen who would be happy just to be able to live at Hogwarts. One of the things that I really loved reading Lord of the Rings was the sense of being part of a fellowship. So, I went to MIT. I studied planets. I graduated and then stayed around for another year to finish a master's thesis where I made the first computer models that predicted oceans and even life under the icy crusts of the moons of Jupiter. And then I went off to Arizona, got my doctorate in record time. Those were the top programs in those days, still are. I figured, I was on my way to a career where I'd be working at some top university, eventually getting a big professorship, $1 million grants from NASA, armies of grad students and researchers working for me. Well, 5 years after my doctorate, I was working and teaching at MIT. This was the big leagues. There's more professional football players in the world than there are professional astronomers. But it wasn't enough. I wasn't happy. I had forgotten why I wanted to do the science. I was having a hard time remembering why I wanted to walk across that bridge, the Harvard Bridge, towards MIT to work in that office, which was on the 5th floor of that skyscraper you see there. At night, at 3 a.m., I'd stare at the ceiling in my apartment, and I couldn't answer the most basic question. Why should I be worried about the moons of Jupiter when there's people starving in the world? I didn't have an answer. So I quit. I quit astronomy. I left my position at MIT, and I joined the U.S. Peace Corps. I told them, I'll go anywhere you want me to go. I'll do anything you ask me to do. And so they sent me to Kenya to live in a mud hut and teach high school in a classroom where there was no glass in the windows and no black on the blackboards. And I said, yeah, that's what I want to do. As soon as I actually got to Kenya, they discovered I had a doctorate, and they moved me out of the rural school, first into a government school and a national school and one of the best high schools in the country. And then 3 months after I started working there, I was moved again to the University of Nairobi to teach graduate students in the physics department astronomy. Now, there was a logic behind their requests. These guys who I was teaching all had jobs waiting for them at the Kenya Science Teachers College. I was teaching the guys who would be teaching the teachers who'd be teaching the kids in the national schools and the government schools and the rural schools, in the place with no glass and no blackboards. So it made sense, but that wasn't why they wanted to learn astronomy. You see, every weekend I would go up country out in Nairobi and visit my fellow Peace Corps friends And everywhere I went, I took a bunch of astronomy images and a little telescope. And I would talk to their schools. And in the evening, I talked to the adults in the villages. And we'd all go outside and look through my telescope. And everywhere I went, the room was packed. And everybody in the village wanted to look through the scope. And they'd go, ooh, when I showed them Jupiter. And ah, when they saw the craters of the moon. And wow, when they saw the rings of Saturn. Of course, just like my friends and family back in America. In fact, just like I say when I look through a telescope. That's what people do when they see the sky through a nice telescope. You know, back in those days, I had a very clever cat. Cat was much better at being a cat than I ever would be. But the cat showed no interest at all in looking through my telescope. Telescopes are for humans. Looking at the stars and going, ah, and then wondering about what are they and who are we and how does it all fit together, that's one of the things that makes us human, more than just well-fed cows. And to deny that to somebody denies them their humanity. But to make it available to everyone reminds us that we are the species that have gone to the moon. It is human to look at the stars and to realize there's more to life than what's for lunch. The very thing that makes us different from a cow or a cat, that aspect that makes us breathe, oh my God, is what we call the human soul. It's what the theologians tell us is the image and likeness of God. And that's why we do astronomy, because it makes you human. Or to put it another way, it gives you joy. And joy is a sign of God's presence. Let me show you joy. The fact that there is a universe at all is fascinating and mysterious. The fact that it's rational and reasonable and able to be understood by some creatures inside that universe, by us, that's amazing. With us, the universe has become self-aware. I came back from Africa, I got a professorship at a small university, and that was great. But then I decided I wanted more. I wanted that sense of working for something bigger than my own career, that sense of doing the work for joy. So, one more time into my room, looking at the ceiling, praying, and the message this time was not to be a priest, that hadn't changed, but to be a brother, a Jesuit brother. So I joined the Jesuits. I expected to be sent to teach at a Jesuit school, but instead they saw I had a doctorate, and they sent me to the Vatican Observatory. And so for the last 30 years, I've been able to use the Vatican's telescope in Arizona, where I took this picture, and to chat with my boss, the Pope, in Rome. It's kind of weird knowing that the Pope knows who you are, knows your name. It's kind of fun, too, though. I even get to be on TV sometimes.
Why does the Vatican have an astronomical observatory? For instance, you're the curator of meteorites at the Vatican. Why do they curate meteorites? Are they looking for the shooting star of David? What?
No, in fact, the whole idea of having astronomers really got started with the reform of the calendar back in the 1500s. And since then, just studying the universe is a great way to remind yourself that there's more important things in life than what's for lunch.
What is for lunch, by the way?
So, that's my story. And what's my final message? Don't be afraid to make choices, even if you don't have all the answers already. But make these choices in a moment of quiet, what we call prayer. And ask yourself, or ask God, what choices are most likely to bring you lasting joy? And one final bit of advice: avoid the smoked octopus.